My goodness. Hello, everyone. I don't know if that story is true. My husband had no witnesses for it, but and I have left a soccer field on an ambulance more than once. But anyway, I am truly delighted and honored to host this panel on workforce multiplier and the future of work. And for anyone who has been reading the news of late, you know there's lots of fear that automation is taking away jobs and replacing humans. This panel is not about that. This panel is about the changing nature of work and work that these two folks have done to really change how we think about work in the future and how we can help workers thrive and prosper in this new era. And so we're going to talk first about workers and how workers are not necessarily thinking about climbing career ladders, but actually navigating career jungles. This is my earring? Okay, we're going to take it off. Great. I'm going lopsided. And we've got an incredible panel. Rubén Harris here, who's CEO of CareerKarma, who's going to talk all about the worker side of things and how it's changing for workers. And then we're going to talk about how on the corporate side, on the demand side, changing the nature of workplaces. So we've got Tony Hsieh, CEO of Zappos, who's going to talk about incredible work that they've done inside the company, building resilience, changing how people do their jobs as a company like Zappos has grown to become a really large company today and, of course, part of Amazon as well. And it's really a treat for me to moderate this from my perspective at Autodesk. So we make design technology that's used to design and make quite literally everything on this planet. So the phone in your pocket, to the car or transportation that brought you here, to this beautiful building and whole cities. And so you could say we've been in the business of automation for a number of decades, 3 decades. And so we're thinking a lot about how our customers' work is changing, construction companies, manufacturing, architecture, and really thinking about how the supply and demand matches up and how we can think about preparing workers for this new workforce and for the changing demands that's going to take. So let's dive right in. Start with you, Rubén. You, in addition to being a professional cellist, he was really sad he didn't bring his cello after that performance. That was amazing. You are the CEO of CareerKarma. So tell us a little bit about what that is and how you're helping address the psychology of work and also workforce transitions.
Yeah, so CareerKarma is an app that matches people with the right coding boot camps and gives them support for the rest of their careers. So essentially, our traditional education system can't keep up with the preparation of workers for the amount of open jobs that are being created. And so when we talk about the future of work, the tech industry is no longer an industry anymore, so all these new industries are being recreated. So rather than focusing on predicting what jobs are going to be created in the future, we decided to focus on software engineers and the job training programs that are effectively preparing people for these different roles. And so currently there's about 500,000 open jobs for software engineering. There's about 50,000 people graduating from 4-year universities and about 36,000 people graduating from coding bootcamps every year. And the people graduating from coding bootcamps are growing at a number of over 50%. And essentially, these people are arguably better trained than the people going from 4-year universities because everybody didn't go to elite schools. And so people are starting to realize that 4 years is too long. And since there's so many different options, career navigation is starting to become increasingly more important for an individual as they're looking for alternatives outside of college. So that's why we're starting here, and I can talk more about that later.
Great. And Tony, you've done incredible work inside Zappos, really changing the culture. Talk about what's coming next for Zappos.
Yes, so I guess just to give some context, we have undergone a number of changes over, it's now almost 20 years at Zappos. Mm-hmm. And we start out with kind of the traditional hierarchical org chart where it's a hierarchy of people. And then 5 or 6 years ago, changed that as we adopted holacracy and made a step towards being more self-organized. And that became a hierarchy of circles or teams. And we have about 1,500 employees, about 300 circles, and employees can belong to multiple teams. And now the next step towards self-organization is we're layering something on top internally that we call market-based dynamics and customer-generated budgeting, where instead of right now hierarchy is still how resource allocation gets done, and transitioning to a more dynamic resource allocation where the org chart is networked, and ultimately we're taking what works in the real world in terms of in external economy and bringing that within the four walls of Zappos. And the reason for that is because if you look at all the research on self-organized human enterprises like cities are resilient, they stand the test of time, they're innovation centers, and there's interesting statistics like every time the size of a city doubles, innovation and productivity per resident increases by 15%. But you get the opposite effect with companies, and it's not generally anyone's fault. As companies get bigger, under a hierarchy, they just become less innovative per employee and less productive per employee. And if you look at stats like, I think Fortune 500 list came out in 1955, and 88% of those are no longer on that list. And the average lifespan of a company in the S&P 500 is, I think it was 30 years and now 15 years and going on the way down. So the default future for companies is death. And that's why if you look at the data, and it's funny, and everyone thinks that if you just focus on scaling and efficiencies and so on, that it's not gonna happen to your company, and that's what Kodak thought, or that's what Tower Records thought, and so on. So there's all these examples of companies that were seemingly unstoppable, and then they were no longer around.
Can you talk a little bit about how the circles, you talked about 300 circles and how that's actually going to work, and then you have a similar kind of circle model.
Yeah, so we're starting out by building or kind of jump-starting a mini economy within Zappos. So rather than top-down budgeting, what used to be your parent circle that gave you a budget is now your primary customer to kind of jump-start the system, and there's a service agreement between you and your parent circle. But then over time, the goal is every circle should get additional customers. So maybe a few years from now, there might be 10 or 20 or more customers per circle. Some of them can be internal and some of them can be external. And then at that point, you no longer really have a boss, because what used to be your boss is just one of 20 or 30 different customers. And then that gives people the ability to navigate and come up with new ideas. And in a hierarchy, if you want to try something new, you have to convince your boss, and then your boss's boss, and your boss's boss. And all it takes is one no to kill an idea. Whereas with our networked approach and customer-generated budgeting, all it takes is one yes to move the idea forward, because every circle is also a potential funder of your idea.
I like the whole network approach, and you've certainly applied that in a totally different context, but in the idea of squads. Do you want to talk a little bit about how you do that, and the fact that workers don't just need skills, they need guidance and mentoring and peer support?
Yeah. So, high level, there's 375 million workers that are going to have to switch careers between now and 2030. So
how many? Say that again.
375 million workers that are going to have to switch careers between now and 2030. Instead of going back to college, they're going to rely on job training programs. So when somebody downloads our app, they take a quiz and we show them which training program is best for them. But what we realized is pointing people in the right direction is not enough. And once we match them with the right program, we put them in a circle of 5 to 20 people like them doing the same thing, because a mom trains differently than a veteran trains differently, vice versa. So putting them in that circle helps them not just learn the skills that they need, but also psychologically push through roadblocks. If you think about college, if most of the world doesn't go to college, it's very difficult to find friends, and you usually find friends through the acquisition of skills that are difficult together. So us creating these small groups within our app allows people to find this connectedness, and we talked a little bit more earlier about the elements of happiness that help them move forward, because what we're entering into is the end of occupational identity, where people are working at multiple companies and going to multiple schools over their lifetime. And so that group of people will help them not just get through it, but also identify the people that are working inside of their companies that are like them, so that they can continue to navigate for the rest of their careers.
And just to give the audience context, that when we were talking about happiness, we were talking about the science of happiness, where research has shown one framework for it is happiness is really about 4 things: perceived control / autonomy, perceived progress, connectedness, meaning the number and depth of relationships, and being part of something bigger than yourself that has meaning to you.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. And so going back to the squad thing,
Yeah.
you know, and these different elements that he just brought up, we actually based it off of a blue zone in Okinawa, Japan, where women live the oldest in the world. And from birth, they commit to groups of 5. And you can look it up in New York Times. It's called The Power of Positive People. And essentially, the mindset is it's easier to go through life knowing that you have a safety net. So for us, rather than predicting what jobs are going to come in the future, we focus on what's not going to change. And what's not going to change is people wanting to know what their options are with respect to what jobs exist, the training programs or their options and information about those options, and the people that are like them that can help them with the positive or negative consequences of those decisions.
Yeah, and I think the importance of squads and circles, and certainly at Autodesk, we're moving entirely to squads because the nature of work is changing. You know, we're no longer working on one project for a long period of time, and so big transition there. So let's also talk about matching workers with employers. Mm-hmm. So you talked about a really interesting thing that now I'm hearing about all the time, which is this idea of income sharing. Mm-hmm. And the fact that you can go to school, big universities starting this, but also coding camps, where you go for free, but then you pledge a certain amount of your salary. Mm-hmm. Can you talk a little bit about that? And then, Tony, how you're using on-the-job training as well?
Yeah, so, student loans are over $1 trillion. And most people can't afford going to college, and it's historically been subsidized by the government. Now you have this concept of an income share agreement that's 1,000xing the market today, not just for coding bootcamps, but even for colleges. So you all can look up VMO Education and Leaf, which essentially are getting income share agreements on over 100 college campuses. And recently, 2U, which is a public education company, just bought Trilogy for $750 million. And now there's elite colleges that have 68, there's coding bootcamps on 68 campuses. So essentially for the first time in history, at least from what I understand, an individual can choose to do what they want to do in life without having to go into debt. So I can say, I want to learn this skill set, and if I don't get the job, I actually don't have to pay anything. But the educational institution guarantees that you will get above a certain salary in a job, and when you get that job, you agree to pay back a certain income up to a cap, so you always know how much you would pay after you get the job. So that's a super important thing that's changed the job market, and it's starting to feed into employer as payer models and all kinds of things to finance education. But Tony, I would say the biggest thing that just happened is Tony James from Blackstone. He just stepped down with James Runchi from the Financial Aid Office to really focus on creating the Education Finance Institute to really make income share agreements the new form of education. And you can look up a lot of things related to that.
Well, and it's certainly changing financing, but it's also changing the incentives for schools and institutions, because now they have a real incentive to help you get a job and to teach the right skills. And we feel that all the time, where our customers can't find the right skills because that's not what the universities are teaching. And so really important model there. And Tony, you talked about a lot of your team coming up through customer support and the kind of learning on the job about how to be entrepreneurial that happens inside Zappos.
Yeah, I forget the exact ratio, but I think 1 out of 3 folks in our organization that aren't in customer service but are in some other department originally came from customer service. So, and for us, that's what we want our brand to ultimately be about. And the skills that they need, some of it is about teaching them how to kind of the basics of entrepreneurship and the understanding and having a culture of experimentation, which we're also taking on the education front. So we have, for example, something that is called 48-Hour Founders, that is kind of like a startup weekend type of thing we do internally for Zappos employees that want to that have an idea for a new offering for their circle. And the way we're kind of transitioning is we started out with, in the software world, there's the words are going from a software monolith to microservices. For non-software developers, it's imagine like 1,500 Lego blocks that are connected into this currently Zappos e-commerce machine, and then we're basically breaking apart those Lego blocks and still keeping them connected so our existing business still runs, but then each of those Lego blocks can offer other menus of services that we would have not thought of in a hierarchy. So as an example, our head of HR is super passionate about running and super passionate about the new hockey team in Las Vegas, the Vegas Golden Knights. And so she's now, with her set of Lego blocks in the HR world, she's launched something called Love Hate Running, which is just a fun 5K running series. And she's also now is doing HR as a service for the Vegas Golden Knights, because they don't have an HR department yet, and so that's additional revenue that's coming in.
Right, so going from selling shoes to selling many different things to now selling services and changing the whole nature of the, go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to say something briefly about the customer support. I think the other, related to income share agreements, they're actually spreading into other skill sets where, our view is actually non-technical roles are going to be bigger in the future of work, just like they are today. And TripleByte recently said that 50% of their developer interviews fail for non-technical reasons. So you're starting to see a lot of people get people to start working in customer support before, or like these squads to learn soft skills so that they can learn how to navigate. And so learning leadership skills, a lot of non-technical things are super valuable. And you're going to see people moving from job to job to job. So I just wanted to say that is spreading to other skill sets as well.
Well, and certainly moving way beyond the 4-year college education to an ongoing lifelong learning. And inside Autodesk, we talk about from K to gray, right? And how do we develop technology that's continually helping people learn how to use the technology in new ways as the field is growing and shifting? So what about apprenticeships? So this is something that the U.S. has not done much of relative to other countries, and yet some states are starting to pick it up and really getting that on-site training.
Yeah, I think a really good example is Adobe Digital Academy. So Adobe has partnered with a coding bootcamp, and essentially they pay for the housing, they pay for the meals, they pay for the training, and then at the end of it, they actually hire them at the end. And they've graduated. They have like 50 engineers that have come through this as of over the last 2 years. I think another good example is Treehouse. They have something called Tech Talent Path. And what they'll actually do is we're moving to a world, instead of just buying talent, they're building talent. So they'll say, all right, here's the Boys and Girls Club in this neighborhood. We're going to partner with them, pay them to learn, and then hire them at a $50,000 job instead of like the traditional engineering salary, and grow talent. And you're seeing that because even if you hire all of the talent that exists today, which most of the staffing industry is focused on, there's not enough to fill the open jobs. So you're going to see more and more companies going downstream. And SAP recently reached out to me to create their help create their apprenticeship council. So you're seeing a lot of people collaborating together to figure out how to partner with these specialized short-form training models to grow talent. And White Hat's doing something really well in London.
So a lot of unfilled jobs. Actually, 7 million unfilled jobs based on something I heard just the other day. Like we can't find the right skilled workers. So how are both of you bringing more workers into the workforce, right? We have billions of people that are not necessarily in the traditional workforce. How are you approaching those populations?
Yeah, so for us, we essentially focus on the long tail. So before we started CareerKarma, we started a podcast in 2016 called Breaking Into Startups. It's reached over 3 million people, and if most people outside of tech actually don't read tech news. And so the first thing to do is make them aware that these training programs actually exist. So we really focused on creating the media and creating the content in channels that they actually read, like Black Enterprise, or in GI Jobs for veterans, or mom blogs and things like that. And once we did that, we started pointing them to the teaching programs for the jobs that they want using a chatbot before we actually productized the experience of learning how to create squads and get into these different programs. So I actually think it starts off with awareness, because a lot of times, like if you think about it, this is a great group of people, but the people that we're talking about are actually not in the room. So they're not aware of these things that are happening. So we got to make sure that people that aren't at Davos or Aspen Institute or Brookings are aware of what's going on so that we can help them level up. So I think it starts with media, and not just media that's consumed, but it's very actionable. And I would just say, like, the best example for me is, like, if you think about Black Panther, the movie, it was based in Oakland, and they had a STEM center. So rather than creating a movie that made billions of dollars, which you can do both of these things, at the end they could have said, here's an address, this is real, you could pull up, right? So not only could it make billions of dollars, but you could also have actionable things that could be done with these things. So I think creating media that's actionable and that has clear takeaways, I think is super important in a collaborative way.
Yeah, and that awareness and reaching those new markets. And that reminds me, I know we have a partner in common with Village Capital, which is building entrepreneur skills among people that are underserved. They don't have the Stanford or Berkeley MBA and getting them into the circle and whatnot. And Tony, you have interesting, diverse group of employees at the Zappos. How have you cultivated that through recruiting and the culture that you've created there?
Yeah, it's so we have 10 core values, and basically living up to those core values is built into our processes. So, including the hiring process, if they're not core values or culture fit, that even if they're great at everything else, we won't hire them. It's also part of the performance reviews, and employees will be fired.
And what's the core value about being weird, keeping it weird?
Oh, we have one that's called create fun and a little weirdness. And
create fun and a little weirdness,
like,
yes.
Yeah. Well, our belief is everyone's weird somehow, so it's more saying we really want to recognize and celebrate each person's individuality, and we want their true personalities to come out in the workplace instead of, putting on a professional work demeanor and then being a different person at home on weekends.
Yeah, right. So thinking about this audience, and I know, Rubén, you said you don't usually come to audiences like this that don't have the workers that you are serving and speaking to. What is one thing that this audience could do to really help change the future of workforce and get more of the people that you're serving?
Yeah, I think just understanding that there's talent that exists outside of college and understand how college is adapting towards these future needs. I think the simplest thing that you could do is actually subscribe to the Breaking Your Startups podcast. I know that sounds like a shameless plug, but it's essentially designed to give insight into what's happening. And then if you want, you can just send me an email, which is just Rubén@CareerKarma.com.
So Breaking Into Startups is the podcast for people that want to really understand how these other communities are working. Yeah. How about you, Tony, in terms of one thing that this audience could really take away, as many of these people run companies, they're executives, entrepreneurs, investors. How should we be thinking about this differently?
I would say really put some thought into how can you have some or even possibly all of your company be as self-organized as possible. Hierarchies don't scale. They don't stand the test of time. As you get bigger, organizations get more bureaucratic. Employees feel they're fighting the machine, and fewer ideas get out. And so that's part of what we're doing. We're doing it initially for Zappos, our own employees, but the goal is to build a platform that other companies can plug into. And so imagine if you wanted to start a cupcake bakery, you probably have to put up a website and do stuff on social, but if that's not your area of expertise, then you can go onto the platform and hire Zappos website builders or Zappos social, for example. And so basically it's kind of like what AWS came out of Amazon's internal needs first, and then enabled startups like Instagram to really cut down their costs and not worry about those parts of their business. And so most startups or small businesses, during the first 2 years, there's 1,001 ways they can do something wrong and die. And in the future, maybe there's only 100 things they can do wrong because they didn't randomly choose their uncle's friend's lawyer to be their lawyer because that's the only lawyer they knew. But if there's this platform, then they could go to Zappos Legal, for example.
Well, and platform is certainly one of the themes. Like, we're each building a platform. You, in that context, you're obviously building a platform of people looking for jobs. And for us, certainly, we're moving to become a platform company where people can build on top of our platform as well. So just in closing, I know we have one minute left. Any final words for this audience?
I would just say, if you are an employer and you're interested in creating an apprenticeship, definitely reach out to me, because I want to, even though we're not as focused on the job search, if you want to learn how to do this, I am connected to a lot of people that can help you create actionable things, and I can point you with a lot of workers that are graduating that would be able to fill those roles.
So lots of workers who can fill roles that you may not otherwise find on your own. Tony.
There's a quote that's supposedly attributed to Charles Darwin, and it's something like it's not the strongest or fastest or most
Fittest.
intelligent of species that survive. It's the one that's most adaptable to change. And I think the same is true for companies, and it's also true for individuals. And so the world is changing faster and faster, and it's going to get harder and harder to keep up with everything. So rather than try to predict what will happen, what if instead thought about how do you make your company, your organization, be able to adapt faster to whatever the new world is, and it's going to continually change.
And that's a perfect note to end on. As we think about having billions more people on the planet, how are we collectively adapting and being more resilient as people, as employers, and collectively? So thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you all.